friends, and welcome to episode 1.2 of the Gorgeous Gourds series. In our last episode, you saw how to fill in two different types of value scales. And although at first glance it seems like that's a really simple thing to do, you were learning a lot of the really basic techniques that you'll need to complete the rest of this project. So we're going to be taking those skills that you learned to create your value scales and applying them to filling in the values of something that's meant to look three-dimensional. So we're going to use the transitions from darks, mediums to lights to help you show light source and the shape of a form. So we're going to take those value scale skills where you learned how to work with the different types of pencils, you learned how to work with the different types of erasers, you also learned how to work with a blending stump. So lots of new things that you're learning, although it seems like it might be pretty simple. And in this episode, I'm going to be demonstrating how to fill in the values for the sphere, the cube, and the cone. So we're going to break these down step by step and complete these together, because although it seems like this might be a very simple task, there are a lot of techniques that you need to understand to make these look realistic like forms. So you'll notice that I did number these, and it appears like these are sort of out of order, and that's just because I want you to do these in order of difficulty. So I'd like for you to start with the easier things to work your way up to the more difficult things. So we're going to begin just by adding in a sliding scale here. And I know that you did just complete two different value scales, so you're probably like eye rolling this hard right now, but I do think it's very helpful to have a full value scale for you to look at as you're doing each one of these, because each one of these shapes needs to contain all 10 of your values. So we're going to begin by filling in our value scale, which you know how to do, so we're just going to skip me demonstrating that part. So this is how my sliding value scale turned out. Make sure that you're working with 6B from 10 through 8, HB from 7 through 5, and your blending stump for 4 through 1, leaving 0 white. Next, we're going to get started working on step number 2, which is the cube. And the reason why we're starting with this is because it's a great example of some pretty simple ways of adding value, because we've got just flat surfaces. So quite a few of these areas are going to be left fairly solid. So we're going to look at our example cube, and the first step is to find the darkest values and work our way out. So on this cube, I can see that the darker value is on the right-hand side, and what I'm going to do is look up to my sliding value scale and try to figure out what value number this is, which to me, it looks like it's about a 10 or a 9, so almost varnished, I'd say, which means that we're going to start with our 6B pencil. So I'm going to begin the same way that we filled in the step sliding scale, and I'm going to just fill this in completely solid, and it doesn't have to be totally varnished, but I do think that it's a value that's between 10 and 9, so pretty darn dark. And I'm just using small circular motions, making sure I'm not filling or going outside of the lines, and filling this in just a nice solid 10 or 9 value. It's important to note that in the example photo here, you can see that the lighting is coming from kind of up above and from behind, because the shadow is projected out this way. So we need to note that because the light is coming from behind and up to the side, it on this side does get a little bit lighter. So we're going to start with about a 7 value and work our way out to a 5. So because we are starting at a 7, that means that we are going to begin with our HB pencil, and we're going to transition it to get just a little bit lighter as we go backwards. So our value scale is going to be going up and down, and I'm going to begin just by starting on this edge. And I like to give myself kind of borders. So I will fill in up against the edge of something first. And I'm working to just fill in this space using small circular motions with my 7 value. And then once I've got my 7 value done, we're going to just move on the way that we did with our sliding scale, which is to go over this edge with our next value, our lighter pressure, to help it transition into our 6th value. So I'm pressing lighter with my pencil here. And then once we've got our 6th value, we're going to help that transition into our 5th value. So that means that I'm pressing even lighter in this section. So I went a little bit lighter than I thought I would need to, because we always want to start out lighter because it's much easier to fix than if we start out too dark. So now I'm going to go over and do one more pass, and my goal here is to help these values transition together a little bit smoother. So I'm trying to help them blend together a little bit by adding one more layer. This is a step that students don't typically like to do, is to go back over and add another layer over something that they've already colored. But as you can see, it really does help those values transition together much smoother. So now that I've got those blended together, I'm going to take my blending stump and I'm going to begin on the lighter side. And I'm blending those values together to make a nice smooth transition. I want you to notice that that did make this a little bit darker. So that's just always good to have in the back of your mind, that blending stumps do sometimes darken your values by quite a bit. And now I'm just blending and pressing a little bit harder in this darker patch to help make sure that you can see that these values are a little bit darker on this edge. So now that that's done, I'm going to look at the top of my cube and realize that, again, it does get a little bit lighter as it goes backwards. And you can see that this is our lightest side by far. I'd say it's probably a 3 to a 0. It fades all the way out to white. So we're going to start with our blending stump, and we're just going to very lightly press up against this front corner. And then we're just going to help that transition to white as it reaches the back of our cube. I might try to fill this in up to that edge on this side so that it looks like the lighting is coming from up here. So the last step is to complete the shadow that goes underneath. And it's important to note that for a shadow, the darkest portion is the entire length of the base, so wherever it touches. And I'd say a mistake that students often make is to not shade in the darkest value on this side as well. So we took our darkest value, I just laid out a number 10, then we're going to transition to a 9, and I'm just kind of filling that space following the shape. So we've got that corner to work with, and that's sort of how we're going to help our values fade. So now I'm going to just continue pressing lighter. And once I start to get to our 7 to 5 range, that's when I'm going to switch to my HB pencil. And I'm just pressing quite a bit lighter, using small circular motions to make sure that I don't leave too many little lines left over. And then remember what we did for our sliding scale, where we help this fade out to white before we come in to use our blending stump to finish the rest. So I'm going to take my blending stump and I'm going to check it off to the side just to see how much is on there and to kind of remove some of it before I come in and blend this out. So I'm going to kind of fill this space. Notice that the shadow does come out to the edge where it's marked here. And then I'm going to just continue towards my darker value. Now, once I've reached my darker value, I can use some of that graphite that's been loaded onto my blending stump to come out and blend those values out again to make it darker. And I can even go back in. I noticed that I lost some of my detail here, so I'm going to add in a little bit, another layer of that dark value just to make sure that you can see that there is a nice smooth transition from all 10 values. So we want to be able to see all of those shades in this shadow section. One last little blend. And that's what we're looking for with our cube. The next shape that we are working on shading is the cone. And there is a very common misconception about how to shade in this shape. So I want to show you what we are trying to do versus what we are trying to avoid, which is the common mistake. So what we are trying to do is to break this cone down into 4 different sections. So an easy way to begin is to draw a line cutting it just right in half, and then a line cutting that in half, and a line cutting the other side in half, so that all of these lines are leading to this one central point. That means that when we add in our values, we are essentially making triangle shapes with each value. So that means that your values get skinnier as they go up. So you can see that the bottom is going to be wider with each value, and the top will get skinnier. The common misconception in the way that people shade this is that you're going to start with your darkest value, and then you're going to have a straight line dividing to make your next value, and then another line for your lightest value, so that it's going straight up and down, and that the width is the same for all of your values. But as you can see in the example, the values all lead to this one central point. So we're working on making a fan of values that lead to this central point. And a good way to begin to help yourself make sure that you're following this step is to start with your blending stump and to draw a line that divides that shape in half. Then we're going to divide this shape in half so that it's leading up to that point. And this side is where you're going to be adding your lighter values. So try to add it really lightly on this side, and we'll divide that in half. So essentially, we're adding our dark values, our medium values, our light values, and then fading out to white in this last section. So we're going to begin our darkest values with our 6B pencil, and I'm going to just start on this side and fill in my darkest line. So this is going to be a number 10 value. I'm bringing this down, and I'm noticing that it does increase just slightly. And then I'm going to kind of start fading this out just a little bit to about a 9. So we start by varnishing on this edge, and then we're fading out to a 9. Now I'm going to start fading out to an 8, and that's going to be just over the top of this line. Make sure that you're keeping your pencil nice and sharp to avoid any little blemishes showing up because your pencil is too dull. So these values are starting to increase as they get farther down on this shape, meaning that they're just fanning out. They're getting a little bit whiter. Now we're going to start lightening up. As you can see, this is about a medium tone. In the example, I'd say we are probably on to our value number 7 here, so that means we're switching to HB. So again, we're going to have to adjust our pressure, and this is going to give us finer lines, so we need to be sure that we're coloring with small circular motions. And I'm just going to transition this to about our 5 right in the middle. So now that I'm about halfway out, I want to be fading to about our 5 here. So I'm just going to help this fade from a 5 all the way out to white. And again, you can see that our lines do start to show up a little bit here because we're working with a harder lead pencil. And that means that we really need to press super lightly to help this transition nicely. So starting at about here, I am going to just go through and erase that leading line that I drew to make sure that I don't have any abrupt edges or something that's making this even harder for me. And I'm going to take my blending stump, and just like we have been doing, I'm going to fade this out to white. And now I'm going to go over the values, starting with our lightest and working our way to the darkest. And once we've done that, we can take some of our darker values and load our blending stump and kind of bring some of those out. And then we can go back through, make sure that everything is nice and smooth, and then we're just going to help create those lighter values so that just the edge is what's left white. So we're making our values 3s, 2s, 1s, leading out to our 0 on this edge here. Now that we've got our smooth transition on our cone, you can kind of clean it up with a solid eraser to make those solid edges. And then we're going to finish up by creating the shadow that extends out to the right. So again, we're going to take our 6B pencil. We're working with a number 10 value, bringing this all the way out to this edge. Remember, it covers the entire edge of this shape where it touches the table. So I'm varnishing and making my number 10 value by filling this in really, really dark with my 6B. Then we're gonna fade out to our 9. And then we're gonna fade out to our 8. Using small circular motions, trying to stay inside of those guiding lines. Now I'm going to switch to my HB pencil to do my values 7 through 5. So again, I had to adjust my pressure to make it a little bit lighter. And now I'm just continuing to overlap these values and press lighter and lighter. And I'm leaving some space to add my lighter values with my blending stump. So I'm going to come in, just check to see how much is on your blending stump because we have been filling in some darker areas. I'm going to start with my lighter end, fade that out to white. Now I'm going to take these values and start with the lighter side and work my way out to the dark. I'm kind of cleaning up the edges here as well, just to make it look a little bit neater. Kind of softening the edges of our shadow. And now I can take some of these more medium tones and extend them out to help our shadow fade. And our shadow doesn't really reach white, so we're gonna just take our blending stump all the way out to the end. Now looking at the example, I could probably fill in a bit more in my medium tone area because it doesn't fade quite that quickly. And there we go. There's our step number 3 for our cone. Last but not least, we are going to be working on our sphere. And just like people struggle with filling in the values and the shape of the cone, we have a right way and a wrong way to fill in the values for our sphere as well. So what we're trying to do here is create crescent moon shapes. So we're going to start with our darkest value, and then notice that the crescent moon shape for our medium tone touches that outside wall, and then our highlight is inside of that. So we're making just repeated crescent moon shapes. So we would have our darker value, our medium, our light, and then our white for our highlight. So a couple of different things to note about starting this is that I think it's really helpful to really pay attention to where your darkest values reach, because they do not reach all the way around. So I gave myself these little indicators of where the darkest values should begin. I'm going to do that on my actual shape as well. Now, something that is really important to note is that the shadows for this are first of all rounded, and second of all on the right hand side. So when you're trying to color something and you want it to be round, it's much easier to draw with like an arch going the opposite direction. So if you're right-handed, your arch tilts towards the left, whereas if you're right-handed to like do it the opposite way, that's when you get these like abrupt edges and lines. So of course it'll be reversed if you are left-handed, but it's much easier to follow the natural arch that your hand makes when you're drawing than it is to try to adjust the way that your lines are to match your image. So something that I find really helpful is actually to turn my paper so that it matches the direction that my hand draws easiest in. So I'm going to just first flip my paper, and I'm going to just pay attention to where my darkest values are. I'm going to sketch out this crescent moon shape that leads to about here. Now, something that I think is really helpful is to then switch to your blending stump and sketch out where the highlight is. And it's just sort of off to the top side. And I'm drawing this really lightly so that I don't have eraser lines left over. And there's my highlight. It's just up towards the top. Now, the rest of my shadows are going to line up with the top of my highlight. Alright, so there are my key lines that help kind of show where my shadows are going to go. Now I'm going to begin, just like always, with my darkest shade with my 6B pencil. I'm going to start with my number 10 value, and I'm using that natural arch that my hand is making and just sort of rotating around my sphere, and I can sort of spin my paper too as needed to reach those little indicators. Now I'm going to spin that around this way and just work to reach those little marks that I gave myself. Now notice that this is just an even line going all the way around. But when we create a crescent moon shape, which if you aren't quite sure what that means, that's like when the moon looks like this, right? So notice that this is a much thicker width than this, right? So that means that our values, just like we did for the cone, are going to increase in some areas. So the shape of this is going to actually be much thicker right in the middle. So I'm kind of giving myself a little guideline for where my darker values are going. So I'm filling in my darkest values just along this edge, and again I'm working with my 6B to create my number 10 and number 9 value. And now I'm going to fade out to my number 8 value as I'm continuing on. So I'm going to just slowly start adjusting and pressing just a little bit lighter, making sure that I'm not leaving any lines that show separation between these values. I want it to be a nice smooth transition, and I want to keep the inside of this as round as possible as I'm continuing in, because we want to just keep shrinking the circle. So now I'm just continuing with my number 8 value, trying to get all the way to this little edge that I gave myself, my first little guideline. So So I'm just continuously spinning this to help make it easier for my natural arch of my hand. And I'm just adding in my number 8 value, helping to transition from one tone to the next. And making sure that my values all come to a point. Right about here. So now I've got my circle that's smaller, and I'm just kind of trying to get rid of any leftover angles that I might have. Now I'm going to switch to working on my values 7 to 5. So I'm switching my pencil as well to an HB. And I'm pressing lighter, trying to change those values to a number 7. And notice that on the example, your value does actually wrap around. It's just lighter. So we're taking our number 7 and just finishing out this little guideline. And we're working on fading. Once we get to this line, we should be at about a 5. So we're trying to keep this nice and smooth in between all of the values. And now I've gotten to this part where I've got a thicker section, that I need to add my values in with. So I'm pressing really lightly, trying to help this thicken up to make a crescent moon shape and to create just a smaller circle on the inside. And just like we have been, we're going to fade our number 5 out to 0 quickly so that it makes it easier for our blending stump to help those transition. So we're fading much sooner than we're actually going to need to, because we're going to come in with our blending stump to create values 4 through 1. And also to leave enough space to have our 0. So now that I've shaded in my darker tones with my 6B, my medium tones with my HB, I'm going to erase that little highlight indicator that I left for myself. And instead of swiping this and smearing all of this work I've just done, I'm just going to shake my paper and then just get rid of any of those smaller pieces with my finger. So now we're going to just test and see how much we have on our blending stump. We're going to help this fade out to nothing along that edge, knowing that we'll still come back to it. We're just working on blending our number 5 through 10 right now. So I'm going to come in along this edge and start blending our lighter values first. Remember not to start with your darker values. So I'm just working my way out, working on those medium tones first. And again, I'm going to keep turning my paper so that I can use that natural arch of my hand to help me. So we're working our way into our darker tones. And so I'm just trying to help these reach a nice smooth transition. So now I'm working on fading in those darker values to make it look like one smooth transition from value to value, rather than having sections of value. And now from here, now that I've got all of my values sort of blending smoothly together, we're going to go back into the center and work on just fading out to our white highlight. So notice that the location of my highlight is towards the top center. And we want to be aware that we were just working with a really dark value. So we might need to kind of press lighter than we normally would to help this fade out to white. So I'm just bringing some of this up to help create my 2s and 3s, and we want to make sure that our highlight that we leave is still very circular. Now I'm going to use my finger just a little bit to kind of blend some of that out. To get those soft edges here. And there we go. So now I'm going to come in and erase any little edges that were kind of sticking out from my sphere. I can erase my little guideline marks. And the last step is to complete the shadow that goes underneath. So with this shape, we need to realize that the base is really quite small because it's not touching the entire base. If a sphere is resting on something, it just has like that tiny little bit that's connected to the table. So our darkest area is actually right in the center of this oval. So we're going to fill in our number 10. And then we're going to fade out to our number 9 and so on. So there's our number 9. Now we'll fade out to 8. And we don't have very much of our lighter value for this, so I'm actually kind of extending my number 8 out a little bit farther. And then I'll switch to my HB to finish out with my number 7. Now that I have that filled in, I'm going to take my blending stump, start with my lighter side, and work my way towards the dark. And once I've gotten to the dark, I can kind of pull some of those darker values out if needed, making sure I'm going all the way up to the edge of the sphere. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope it was helpful learning how to fill in all of the values for those different shapes. And in the next episode, we're going to be bumping the difficulty level up just a little bit and using those same techniques to fill in something a bit more complicated, like this pumpkin that you'll see down at the bottom. So I will see you there for the next episode. Thanks for watching.